This video is sponsored by Linode. Thanks, Linode. Use our affiliate link below. You can get $60 for your initial credit. You can play around with their Kubernetes engine. It's going to be awesome. You can also use Linode for this video, for this setup in this video. It's pretty awesome what we plan to do. I've got wendell.tech, like that's a domain name, but I want to host stuff on the internet, but I'm also kind of a data hoarder. And my internet connection is pretty fast, so it doesn't make sense to me to pay for really expensive cloud hosting. But I can still get a benefit from cloud hosting, and that is I can run a machine in the internet that sort of protects my home setup that's on my LAN from just the ravages of the internet. At least provides a little bit of protection and a little bit of obfuscation. So I can terminate wendell.tech on a Linode, but it acts as a gateway for my home network. A bunch of machines on my home network. Yeah, it's a little dangerous, and yeah, you got to dot the I's and cross the T's, and there's a little bit of risk here, know what you're doing. But I'm going to show you how to set this up with HAProxy. And there's actually a GUI for HAProxy called HAProxy-WI that I'm also going to show you. So let's dive in and take a look. Now, if you're following on Patreon, this is sort of the second version of this video. This is something that I've been working on for a long time. I sort of did the first version of this, or the first video on this on Patreon to get some feedback from patrons and to sort of run through some setup. And big thanks to Snazzy Labs, because he let me use him as the guinea pig, I guess, to do this setup. And so we went through and set up his stuff like this with his own domain, and sprinkled in some special sauce just for Snazzy. So that's pretty awesome. Thanks, Snazzy. There's a how-to on the forum, and this is going to kind of run through that. But here's the idea. Here's sort of the big picture idea. We set up subdomains like plex.wendell.tech and mb.wendell.tech, which is another media server, and nextcloud.wendell.tech. And these subdomains run services. Now, normally you could just set up, multiple nodes or multiple virtual hosts on a single node and be able to run all those services out in the cloud. All your files and everything are stored in the cloud. Well, for me, I actually want to run stuff locally, and like an email server. Again, with the data hoarding, want to run an email server, but I don't necessarily know that I want to have all of my emails forever stored in the cloud. I mean, a lot of bad things could happen with that setup. That might not be the best setup. Somebody could break in and steal stuff, and maybe that would be terrible. I kind of want to have my email local so I can have my arms around it, but I don't want to run an email server on the public internet. Well, wouldn't it be awesome if you could have a server on the internet that acts as your gateway and it forwards traffic to your home connection, and your home connection only accepts inbound traffic from that machine on the internet? That's a little bit more secure. It's also a little bit more obfuscated, so that bots and there are search engines for vulnerabilities now, like Shodan. Shodan just scans the internet, and then later, if it's like, oh, this version of this is vulnerable, you can just go to that search engine and say, show me who's running this version of this service, and immediately find a bunch of servers that are vulnerable. Well, if you run this setup and you do it right, those kinds of automated scanners are going to have a real tough time figuring out what's going on with your Linode, because it looks like it's just static web page hosting. But if you massage it a certain way, or you go to a special URL, or you do HTTP authentication or HTTP certificates authentication, then it's going to give you a different answer. Now, this setup is pretty basic. We are going to set up Let's Encrypt. I'll walk through that. But I want to introduce you to HAProxy. It stands for High Availability Proxy. It's the reliable, high-performance TCP HTTP load balancer. Yeah, it's going to just load balance your single home internet connection, but it's a really well-supported, robust, open-source solution. It can proxy HTTP connections as well as email. Yeah, you can set up an email and mail exchanger, set your MX to be the Linode machine, but it's actually just going to proxy that connection back to your home machine, and your home machine is actually going to run all the stuff that it needs to run to, handle your email. And your ISP can't detect this because your home machine, your home firewall, is only going to accept a connection from the Linode, and everything between the Linode and your home connection, if you do it right, is encrypted, and it doesn't even run on normal ports anyway. So like if your ISP blocks inbound port 25, not a problem. It's port 25 to your Linode machine, and then like some random port like in the 50,000s, which looks like just normal regular internet traffic, from the Linode machine to your internal mail server. Yeah, it's not a big deal to do that. You can have all those different services running on different ports, But on the front end, you don't have to specify the port number. You just go to https, nextcloud.windle.tech and plex.windle.tech, and based on the name, it figures it out. That's the magic of HAProxy. All right, let's dive into the how-to. So if this sounds like it's a little too complicated and you need a GUI, that's HAProxy-WI. But I'm going to come back to that, because in order to use HAProxy-WI, the GUI, you need a working HAProxy and ideally also a working Nginx, which is a web server. It's a pretty awesome web server. So let's start with setting up the basics. And the first thing you need to set up is DNS. So I'm talking about names like windle.tech and plex.windle.tech. And the easiest thing to do is to set up a wildcard, a DNS wildcard. So you can set up, if you have your own domain name, most of your registrars, you can just enter an asterisk for the A record or the quadruple A record. A quadruple A record is for IPv6, a single A record is for IPv4. You use a star for that, and then you can specify the IP address of your Linode machine. Now, it doesn't have to be Linode, it can be on Amazon EC2, but Amazon's not sponsoring this video, Linode is. You could also run this on your home connection. Like if you're cool with a DNS entry pointing to your home internet connection and sort of amplifying the background chatter of things on the internet trying to break in, sort of the zombie army. I mean, you can run it on your home connection. You'll have to change the how-to a little bit. There's sort of less extra steps. Your proxy basically just has a public IP address on one side and LAN IP addresses on the other side. So you don't have to forward as many ports through your firewall. You really just need that HTTPS port forwarded through your firewall, and probably also port 80 unencrypted. But the only thing port 80 is really going to do is just redirect traffic to port 443 for the SSL encryption. And we'll get to SSL. I've got a setup here with Let's Encrypt, which is a little different than what HAProxy-WI, the GUI, does out of the box. But I've got a script for helping you out with Let's Encrypt, but we'll get to that in a how-to. So, setting up DNS, sort of a first step. And I think, I've explained at a sort of a high level what we're going to do. So once you've got DNS set up and all of your various subdomains, any subdomains that it could be, pointing at your Linode IP address or the machine where you're going to run HAProxy, then you're in pretty good shape. I would go ahead and configure Nginx, set up Nginx and set up Nginx. You don't need SSL on Nginx. You want to set up Nginx to run on port 81 on localhost. It doesn't even have to listen on your public IP address. You can just set it up to listen on localhost, so you've got less of an attack surface area. And that's just the best practice, really. So port 80 is going to actually be serviced by HAProxy as well, but on port 80, on HAProxy, we're just going to forward all of that traffic to localhost port 81, which is Nginx. And then in our Nginx configuration, as you can see in the how-to, the Nginx configuration just says, oh, you're on HTTP. Now you need to redirect, 302 redirect to https:// whatever host name you put in, and that's it. So, and the URL, so if there's a URL. So basically, that's just a catch-all. It's like if you accidentally type HTTP, it's just going to try to force you to HTTPS, which is also handled by HAProxy. For this how-to, I'm using CentOS, and it's just a yum install HAProxy, yum install Nginx. Not really a big deal. You do have to configure, if you're using CentOS, you do have to configure SE Linux to permit the HTTP server, Nginx and HAProxy in this case, to make outbound proxy connections, and you do need to permit the HTTP server, Nginx, to run on a non-standard port 81. There are some built-in ports. I could have run it on another port other than 81 by just querying which ports were available, but I forgot about that when I set this up, so it's just as easy to add the port to the list of allowed ports. Now you might be thinking, well, I don't want to do all this command line stuff. I want to do it from the GUI. It's like, well, it's good for you to have some idea of what's going on at the command line level and then sort of manage it with the GUI after the fact. Once you get Nginx set up and once you set up your front ends, then you can sort of revisit it with the HAProxy-WI GUI. So we'll come to that in just a minute. Once you've got your HAProxy set up, you can edit your /etc/HAProxy/HAProxy.cfg just as it is in the how-to on the forum. And I've got an example front end for you there. The thing to understand with HAProxy is that it can proxy a couple of different ways. One of those ways is it will actually sniff or look at the HTTP header and then make some determination as to what it should do with that traffic based on what's in the HTTP header. SSL has this, most modern browsers have this feature called SNI, which means that with the SSL request, it also passes the host name. So you can have one IP address and one port, but you can actually run a whole bunch of websites on that one IP address. We've been doing this for 10 years with unencrypted internet connections, but with SSL, because everything was encrypted, it was previously hard to do that. The SSL specification had to be modified, and that's the SNI specification. So older browsers like Internet Explorer 6, for example, struggle with SNI, but just about everything under the sun supports SNI at this point. So when you do an HTTPS request, it will pass the DNS name along with it. And HAProxy knows how to read that DNS request. So we create a front end that has all the rules here, these ACL rules that will be handled based on the host name. Now, you don't have to do checks based on host name. You can actually do a lot of checks based on other things. And in fact, Plex Media Server is a little persnickety. Like if you just do the host name type proxying, it didn't seem to be quite enough in my particular setup. I actually had to add some special rules to handle Plex, to handle a proxy for a Plex connection. And with the Plex connection, the front end is SSL, but also the back end is SSL. So I'm sort of introducing more stuff that HAProxy does. So this one front end that's running on port 443 is like a traffic cop, and it decides which way it needs to route your request to which back end based on that host name. That means that you also need multiple back end definitions in the HAProxy configuration so that it knows exactly where to route your stuff. Now, the config that I have in the how-to, you're not going to be able to copy paste that and just use that, because I've got a lot of backends in this example configuration to keep it, not from being not super confusing. Doesn't have all of those backends, but you can see the backend definitions are very simple. We've got basically what you want to call it and the IP address that you want to send that traffic and the port. And so this is on your local firewall. This is your public internet connection on your home connection or wherever these servers are physically located, and the port number on which this service is running. I'm imagining most of you are just running a very simple NAT setup at home, network address translation. And so like most of your internal IPs are like 192.168.1.1.2.1.3, and your gateways maybe .1.254, something like that. On your home firewall, you'll forward from your one public internet IP on some random high numbered port. I would suggest a port over 10,000, just because ISPs can do funny stuff with port numbers less than 10,000. Forward some port more than 10,000 only from your Linode's public IP address. You can set those security options so it doesn't just let anybody in on those port numbers. It's only traffic from your Linode's IP address or your cloud server's IP address on that same port number to a particular service. So in the example here, we're running, Plex Media Server on a non-standard port, but it doesn't really matter, because when you just go to https plex.windle.tech, HAProxy takes care of that request that came in on port 443, the standard HTTPS port, and then forwards that through, that plumbing to the weird port on the public side, and then the firewall itself will go ahead and forward that to an internal 192.168. Whatever IP address that it happens to be running on, and like magic, the Plex server is available. This works pretty much the same for any HTTP request. The one exception to that is the mail server. With the mail server, I'm going to suggest that you use TCP style forwarding. I didn't quite get to it in the how-to, but if you want to run an MX, you forward port 25 to some other port, not 25. Almost guarantee you your ISP is going to block that. You can run some really high port from your Linode machine on your firewall and your internal side of it. And you're going to want to use TCP forwarding, and you're going to want to check the HAProxy documentation, which is quite good. That's the HAProxy service, not the GUI, HAProxy-WI. You're going to want to check the documentation for doing TCP forwarding. That doesn't work based on host name. So any host name, port 25, it will accept an inbound connection, and it will forward to your home connection. Now, your home connection doesn't actually have to be up all the time. Email is actually very resilient. The email protocol means that when some server is trying to send your server email, if your server is down, it'll actually retry without any error for up to 4 hours. That's the default. So if your internet connection is intermittently up and down, as long as it's not down for more than, say, 4 hours, this actually works really well as as an email proxy, because you can run your email out on the internet, and you can actually even add services to this. You can chain services together. So if you want to do gray listing, you can forward port 25 to a local port on your Linode machine, just like we're doing with Nginx. Let the gray listing thing sort of say, is this a good connection or not? What IP address is this coming from? And then forward it on to your internal machine, because your internal machine is not going to know exactly necessarily everything it needs to know about the IP address that came from and some other parameters there. So you probably do want to do gray listing, and that's for a future how-to. If you want to, join the Level 1 Patreon if you want to fund this kind of thing, because it took a little while, as some of our patrons can tell you from the first version of this. So once you've got this working at a very basic level, at a command line level, you can use the HAProxy-WI GUI, but I'm still not quite ready. I'll mention one thing about Nginx. So in the how-to, Nginx is configured on port 81. So you install Nginx, and by default it's on port 80. I switched that in the configuration to port 81 because I want HAProxy to listen on port 80. And the reason for that is that I want to serve a static website with Nginx and potential for other things later. So an unencrypted connection comes in on port 80, and that hits HAProxy, and then HAProxy says, oh, this is unencrypted, forward it to Nginx. And then Nginx says, well, just forward this to port 443, which will then be handled by HAProxy. The really interesting thing that I can do, though, is I can configure a default rule in HAProxy so that any domain name that is not recognized in the configuration, anything I don't explicitly have an ACL rule for, will also get redirected to the local Nginx server, and I'll just serve a basic splash page. So all the bots and crap like that scanning the internet, if they encounter this, they'll just get a splash page. Now I can also make it to where that plex.windle.tech requires HTTP authorization or SSL certificate authorization, or plex.windle.tech/some domain name, and it'll make it a lot harder to discover, for a bot to discover what those URLs are and sort of scan it even based on host name. So it is a little bit security by obscurity, and security by obscurity is not really security at all, but every little bit helps. Don't do that as your only measure, but be aware that it's an option, and there's some fun stuff that you can do with that. HAProxy-WI. So my suggestion for installing HAProxy-WI is to do it through Docker, and it does require a little bit of a subscription. It's from one guy, so vetted security, I don't know, but this is the only GUI that I could find for HAProxy-WI that is very, very good. Now, if you run pfSense on your router, it actually has HAProxy built in, and there is a GUI for it in pfSense. So if you're using something like pfSense for your home router and you're not going to do the Linode thing, just out of the box, it totally works fine, and you have a pretty reasonable HAProxy GUI. It doesn't look anything like the HAProxy-WI GUI, but it is a reasonable GUI. HAProxy-WI GUI actually does a lot of other stuff like monitoring, and it can also manage Nginx as well as HAProxy. So it'll help you write the ACL rules, and it has a GUI for creating the rules initially. But then once the rules are created, it just gives you a textual editor that you would use to edit the rules. So what my suggestion for setting it up is to install Docker on your Linode machine, and then install the HAProxy-WI Docker container. When you create the Docker container, if you're following the documentation on the HAProxy website, which is fine, I don't need to rewrite that, one of the steps says to have it listen on port 443. That's the only step you need to change. My suggestion would be to make it listen on port 8443, because your Linode with its single public IP address, port 443, is meant for the traffic that is going to your Nextcloud and your Plex and your all that kind of stuff. You could forward it through HAProxy itself, but then if there's something wrong with your HAProxy config, you can break it. It's easier to just have it listen on port 8443, and then you can go to windle.tech:8443 and get the HAProxy login GUI. You did remember to set a good password. By default, 3 accounts are created. You'll want to disable the ones that you don't use and set a secure password on the ones that you do. And if you're going to just use admin, change the admin username. Like, that's a security best practice. Don't have an account called admin. Pick pick your name or something that is not easily guessable by a bot that's just going to scan the internet and look for this kind of thing. Now here's the rub. Here's the only thing that is slightly unsettling about this software, other than it's just from one guy, which it is open source and you can compile it from GitHub, but he has a subscription service, and we'll talk about that. You need to upload an SSH key that has access to modify the configuration on your Linode. So we've got this Docker container running inside a larger Linode machine, and we want to configure the Docker container to be able to connect via SSH to the host machine. So literally in the configuration for HAProxy, it's like configure servers. It means servers that are already running HAProxy and Nginx. So we can create an SSH key on the Linode machine, just SSH-keygen -t RSA if you want to create an RSA key, and upload that public and private key to our Linode machine, and then configure the public key and the authorized keys for the root user or another user that has permission to modify the HAProxy configuration. Using root is kind of unsettling to me, but it would be a lot more steps to configure a user that is locked down to use that. So depending on what your needs are for security, know that that's like maybe a little asterisk and an exercise left to the reader and or viewer, and maybe something for me to revisit in a future video. But HAProxy will literally connect via SSH, load the configuration, give you stats and all this other kind of stuff. It also gives you some neat graphs and monitors uptime and shows you little beads about status and updates and things like that. It's really meant for more of like a commercial use case, I suppose. But I emailed the author and talked to him because initially he had some fairly expensive subscription options, and he added a lesser expensive subscription option since I talked to him, because I was like, hey, this would be a good thing, a good GUI for home users. And it may be the case that the work that I've done and the work that he's done, maybe we can just wrap that all up inside one Docker container. So it'll run HAProxy-WI and everything, plus HAProxy itself, plus Nginx inside one container for like the home user use case. And then you can just handle everything at once. The one thing that it will handle SSL. You can paste your SSL private key and your certificates into the GUI, and then it will configure HAProxy with that for you, which is nice. But you don't actually have to do that if you use the script that I wrote for Let's Encrypt. And so that's the last part of the how-to that's on the Level 1 forum. So Let's Encrypt is awesome. It's a free SSL certificate service. Just know that when you request a Let's Encrypt SSL certificate, the SSL certificate that you requested goes to a website somewhere. So that is not secret information. So if I requested superfoobar secret something or other .wendell.tech, and it's like, no one's ever going to be able to see that because it's hidden behind a wildcard and I'm going to do special things with that. It doesn't actually work that way, because it's going to show on the SSL certificate, which is going to show on the Let's Encrypt side. Yes, you can get a wildcard SSL certificate from Let's Encrypt, but you have to add a DNS entry for that. Again, an exercise left to the reader, but there you go. So with Let's Encrypt, with the script here, what it does is it stops Nginx and HAProxy, and then it runs the Nginx, the certbot standalone. And so certbot will then listen on port 80 and 443 for the challenges. You specified the domain names that you're using. That's what the -d is in the example script here. It'll get the certificate, and then it'll take the key and the certificate and concatenate them together, which is the format that HAProxy needs, and it'll stick it in the etc. folder. And then HAProxy you can specify in your HAProxy configuration to use that file, and then the script will restart HAProxy and Nginx. So you can cron this script to run, like say once a week or once a month or whatever, and it will run and renew your SSL certificate, and because it's stopping and starting HAProxy, it'll be fine. This isn't a good way to do it for a production system, because there's going to be that 30-second period where your stuff is completely unavailable while you get new SSL certificates. You definitely should do the Dns Wildcard thing, because the challenges go through the DNS side that way. But when I was setting that up, certbot was actually crashing on CentOS trying to do that, and so there's a ticket open for that on GitHub. And it's a known issue with the certbot and wildcard certificates and the plugin for that and CentOS and something about a Python version. So you can also just specify all the different domains you're going to use, and you'll get one certificate that has all those domains on it. If you buy a wildcard certificate that's good for like 3 years, you can literally just paste it in the HAProxy GUI and you're good to go. So this is an adventure, and it's kind of a long adventure, and there's not like, this really isn't complicated. There's just a lot of steps. But if you do this, you'll have a lot more clear understanding of how internet plumbing works, or doesn't work, depending on what your needs are. And there's some other little useful nuggets I didn't explicitly call out in the how-to about mechanically how all of this works, but I fully expect a lot of comments on the Level 1 forums. Again, special thanks to Linode for helping sponsor this, and big thanks to Snazzy Labs for being my guinea pig for testing this, and also our patrons. A lot of our patrons and Floatplane subs asked for this kind of a thing because I've mentioned, it's like, hey, wouldn't it be neat if you had this kind of a setup? And the reality is, like, the smallest, least expensive Linode machine that you can get will run this just fine, and it'll work great. You don't need a lot of storage, you don't need a lot of CPU horsepower, and this will be a front end to whatever sort of beastly system you've got running internally. I mean, you could have 100 terabyte Plex server behind this, and it'll just cost you, a very, very small amount of money a month to run. I mean, you could even run this on, you could basically run this on a Raspberry Pi on the internet if you really wanted to. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of horsepower. So, I'm Whittle, this is Level 1. This has been a look at HAProxy, and by proxy, HAProxy-WI. I'm signing out, and I'll see you later.